Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome from Brussels and very much welcome to this webinar on the unintended impact of European sustainability standards in global food systems. Food systems are directly related to the Sustainable Development Goals, and there is often the assumption that EU standards only affect European farmers, but the Green Deal architecture will have a significant human impact on rural activities around the globe. Latin America, Africa, and India, among others, will have to adapt and integrate this shift of the paradigm of sustainability within their own food systems. And therefore, new sustainability standards will most probably affect the EU third countries' trade relations. At ELO, we have been working on this theme for some time, and last year we organized an expert workshop in order to explore the unintended consequences of those European sustainability standards. And here are some of the main ideas that we had and that came out of those discussions. Now, overall, the EU Green Deal is an opportunity to push for development of sustainable agriculture, both in Europe and around the world. And its success will rely on close collaboration and cooperation with third countries and support for trade partners by enabling their access to European technology. But the EU should also take a holistic approach in leading the change to sustainable food systems at a global level by rather convincing trading partners to adopt similar agendas than imposing a European standard worldwide. Now, the high diversity of environmental conditions and farming practices across the world make it extremely difficult to set up the same measures at an international level. It should also be taken into consideration that new standards should be sustainable in the context of growing population and therefore demand. While it is necessary for the EU to export knowledge, we should also put ourselves in the position to learn. The farm to fork strategy is rather incomplete, as it does not consider the implications on trade flows. For instance, on the EU's position as a major trade bloc for agri-food products. And there are a couple of ways to ensure sustainability, and we have to take them into account at trade level. Mandatory sustainability standards that also recognize local issues and might even require different approaches, but also multilateral environmental agreements, sustainability clauses in trade agreements, and labeling requirements. As you can hear, a lot of work to do as well at the European level as abroad. And this is an important issue, and we have to make sure that we have the good knowledge and that we understand what is going on. And for that reason, I'm glad to see that the organizers have been able to bring a very high level panel together to discuss with us this afternoon this topic. I would say I leave the word to Dave Keating, and I wish all of the panelists success for this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jürgen. So my name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based in Brussels, and I'll be guiding us through today's conversations. Now, here in Brussels, we have many hot topics that are working through the legislative agenda right now, and two of the biggest ones are the Fit for 55 climate package and the farm to fork agricultural strategy, and they very much intersect. Both are sitting under the umbrella framework of the European Green Deal, and both will have a significant impact on rural activities, not just in Europe, but also around the globe. Latin America, Africa, and India, among others, will have to adapt and integrate this shift of paradigm in terms of sustainability within their own food systems. So today we're going to be talking about what the reverberation effects that might be felt from EU sustainability policy all over the world. We'll be asking, what are those effects? What are the risks of those effects? What are the benefits of those effects? And how can that be incorporated into trade policy as the EU looks toward the future? Now, you all at home will be able to ask your questions to the panelists that are speaking today. You can do that using the Q&A feature on Zoom. It's the button down at the bottom, all the way on the right. You can go ahead and type your questions in there now if you already know what you'd like to ask, and I'll be reading those out to the panelists later. It's great if you can let me know your name and your organization, but you're free to ask anonymously if you would like as well. And also, it's very helpful if you can say specifically which panelist your question is to. Okay, now, to start us off today, we'll have a presentation of a paper by Alan Matthews, Professor of European Agricultural Policy at Trinity College, Dublin. Professor Matthews' paper is based on the outcomes of a previous ELO workshop, and it's focused on the implications for third countries of sustainability standards related to the agri-food elements of the European Green Deal. Professor Matthews, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Dave. I'm just going to take a moment to open my screen. And hopefully you can see that. Indeed, this presentation draws on a paper commissioned by the ELO and currently under preparation that examines the implications of the European Green Deal for agri-food trade with developing countries. So the discussion today will help to feed into and finalize the paper. My particular focus is on what I call vulnerable developing countries, by which I mean both least developed countries as well as the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries that have had a particular trade relationship with the EU, around 70 countries in all, although similar issues will also apply to other low-income developing countries. We're all increasingly aware, as Jürgen has pointed out, of the challenges that face our food system to provide healthy and adequate nutrition for all, to ensure decent livelihoods while remaining within planetary boundaries. Food production results in air, water, and soil pollution. It contributes to the loss of biodiversity and climate change, and consumes excessive amounts of natural resources. At the same time, unhealthy diets contribute to obesity and the problem of non-communicable diseases. The European Green Deal requires that food placed on the market should not only be safe, but also sustainable and contribute to better health outcomes. Sustainability requirements for food cover climate, environment, social and animal welfare impacts. They relate to production practices, the way a product is produced, rather than product characteristics. Implementing these requirements and changes will have a significant impact on the competitiveness of EU producers as well as international trade in food. And these changes will have implications not least for the vulnerable developing countries. The EU has committed to helping these countries reach the UN Sustainable Development Goals, particularly through its commitment to policy coherence for development. This requires that it considers the impacts of its domestic policy changes on the interests and needs of these countries. The Green Deal and Farm to Fork strategies set out a series of targets and actions that will strengthen the sustainability criteria that EU farmers must meet. At the same time, there have been many developments that focus on the external dimensions of the Green Deal. This began with the publication of the new EU trade policy strategy, which underlined the role of import standards and asserted the legitimacy of applying production requirements to imports based on the need to protect the global environment or to respond to ethical concerns. The CAP political agreement in July 2021 included a statement by the Council and Parliament calling on the Commission to produce a report assessing the rationale and feasibility of applying EU health and environmental standards to imported agricultural and agri-food products by June of this year. A mirror clause related to the use of antibiotics in animal production formally took effect last month, although it is yet to be implemented. The Commission has agreed to review the way it sets maximum residue limits and import tolerances for pesticide residues to take global environmental impacts of pesticide use into account. It has proposed a regulation on deforestation-free supply chains. Tomorrow, it will publish a draft directive on sustainable corporate governance that will require mandatory environmental and human rights diligence by companies. It has proposed a carbon border adjustment mechanism for 6 commodities, though there is no proposal at the present time to extend this to food. It has embarked on a review of trade and sustainable development chapters in its free trade agreements. It's undertaking a review of animal welfare legislation, which will consider a requirement that similar animal welfare requirements should be applied at import, in particular as regards the use of cages, as in the EU. And finally, the Commission has proposed a regulation for a sustainable food system framework, which, among other things, will seek to avoid the externalization of unsustainable practices and to raise global standards while remaining within planetary boundaries. The French EU presidency this semester has made one of its priorities the reciprocity of trading standards. In other words, ensuring, chiefly by means of mirror clauses, that agri-food products imported into Europe abide by the EU's environmental and health standards. And the Agri-Fish Council yesterday discussed this issue for the first time. We can identify 3 potential objectives of these trade policy measures: to safeguard EU production capacity by ensuring that EU producers compete with imports on a level playing field, to avoid offshoring the negative environmental consequences of EU consumption through existing or increased imports, and to raise global sustainability standards by leveraging access to the EU market to give a stimulus to exporting countries to raise their standards in turn. The trade policy measures that available to ensure greater coherence between trade policy and Green Deal objectives include multilateral, bilateral, and unilateral measures. So multilateral measures refer to raising international standards in bodies such as the Codex Alimentarius or the World Organization for Animal Health, or negotiating multilateral environmental agreements such as the Paris Agreement or the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. Bilateral measures refer to introducing sustainability clauses in free trade agreements, or supporting the transition to more sustainable practices in third countries through financial and technical assistance. The EU also has a wide range of unilateral measures at its disposal, of which mandatory due diligence and mirror clauses are seen as the most effective, and as we have seen, figure prominently in recent Commission initiatives, as well as the French presidency priorities. I want to focus on mirror clauses just for a moment. One of the problems in evaluating the impact of mirror clauses is that so far they've been mainly discussed at a fairly conceptual level. There is limited information to assess what they would mean for international trade in practice. One issue is which sustainability requirements would be covered. The mirror clause on the use of antibiotics expressly bans the import of products where antibiotics have been used for growth promotion purposes, or where antibiotics on a critical list reserved for human medicine have been used. But EU producers also face other restrictions on the use of antibiotics that are not included in this mirror clause. So similar issues of coverage and definition will arise in setting mirror clauses for other sustainability criteria. Another issue is how mirror clauses will be enforced. Official controls test products at the border, for example, for residues of pesticides or antibiotics. But sustainability standards refer to how products were produced. And this is not always evident in the product itself, and particularly in the case of processed products. What might be solutions? Will imports have to be accompanied by an official certificate declaring compliance with EU standards, thus requiring separate supply chains in exporting countries, as is the case for hormone-treated beef? Will enforcement be left to private actors to exercise mandatory due diligence? Will the EU only import from countries that have brought their legislation into line with EU standards? The failure so far to explain how the antibiotics mirror clause will be enforced, despite the legislation being in place now for 3 years, suggests these enforcement issues are not simple. We can also ask how effective mirror clauses will be in raising standards in third countries. On the one hand, exporters often produce to the standards of the most demanding market. This suggests that insisting that exporters meet high EU standards when trading with the EU could also influence their trade with other countries, thus amplifying the EU regulatory effect. On the other hand, if meeting high EU standards is too costly, exporters may simply decide to divert their exports to other markets where standards are lower. There's also the question how mirror clauses will interact with existing private standards. These are often more demanding than public standards, so some of the trade impacts of higher public standards may already be factored into trade flows. If private actors are asked to police the higher public standards through mandatory due diligence, this can have implications for the sourcing strategies of private traders. Unilateral actions have advantages and disadvantages relative to multilateral action with respect to the three objectives set out earlier for trade policy instruments. Strong and effective multilateral agreements remain the best way to raise global sustainability standards and avoid the competitiveness impacts and problems of leakage and outsourcing of pollution and environmental pressures that can occur when the EU alone raises its standards. The problem is that multilateral solutions only move at the speed of the lowest common denominator, and the EU rightly wants this process speeded up. Hence the rationale for using access to its market as an additional lever to promote the global transition. But unilateral measures come with risks. Exporting countries that feel their market access is diminished may seek to take retaliatory action using WTO dispute settlement procedures. Exporting countries may question the existence of a level playing field when they see EU farmers able to access financial support for the green transition that is not available to them. Finally, there's the question how to avoid potential adverse effects on vulnerable developing countries. We first need to identify the commodities that the EU imports from these countries. And this chart shows that 70% of their exports consist of just 4 product categories: cocoa, fruits, fish preparations, and coffee. And indeed, 3 of these categories will be the subject of the panel discussions in just a moment. Raising sustainability standards also in countries that export to the EU is a desirable objective. But in the absence of cost-effective alternatives, EU policy measures can have adverse impacts on some sustainable development goals in vulnerable developing countries. To ensure policy coherence for development, measures must meet 4 criteria: a sufficient transition period to allow alternatives to be developed, applying the principle of special and differential treatment where health and safety of EU consumers is not an issue. The commitment of significant EU resources to help farmers in vulnerable developing countries to adapt their production practices where justified. Just transition principles in Europe emphasize that those affected by change should be consulted and have a say in managing that change. This principle should also apply to the external dimensions of the Green Deal. It may be that the concept of green alliances set out in the Farm to Fork strategy, which remains to be concretized, could be used for this purpose. And finally, the EU decision-making must have mechanisms where the interests and needs of these countries are explicitly considered. Good mechanisms are in place for legislative proposals, but the silo nature of decision-making in the Commission may inhibit a holistic view when more routine decisions with potentially significant effects for developing countries are taken. With that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Matthews. Now, next, we're going to get an EU point of view from Carla Montesi, Director for the Green Deal and Digital Agenda at the Directorate General for International Partnerships of the European Commission. Carla?
Many thanks, Dave. Open the line. It's fine. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for this invitation, for the I'm very delighted to present the European Union take on, particularly on the agri-food standards. Let me start by saying that build Europe into a climate neutral continent by 2015. This is a huge challenge. This is a huge engagement from Europe. Now, this implies bring transformational change in the way we produce and we consume. But of course, it's also a big opportunity that we should take. It's clear that Europe on this can be successful only if we work together, hand in hand, with our partner countries. And that the green transformation of the European Union economy generate a significant impact in the rest of the world. And this is why the Green Deal architecture across the globe. And let me be clear from the beginning that the European Union stand ready for partner countries. So it's clear for us that what we plan is that the business, the
Hi, Carla. So, Carla, we seem to be having some connection issues with you. I think we may have to move on to the panel. Maybe we can sort out the connection and bring you in later. Otherwise, I think we'll have to move into the panel because I think we've lost you entirely now. So let's move on to the first panel then, which is the panel on coffee and cocoa beans. So on this particular, in this particular area, the EU is an important region for the cocoa sector. It's responsible for more than half of the world's cocoa bean imports. The chocolate industry is 100% dependent on cocoa imports, and most cocoa beans are shipped directly to the EU, primarily from developing countries in West Africa. So a lot of the sustainability policies of the European Commission are going to affect this particular area quite intensely. In 2020, more than 55% of the EU's cocoa import market share came from the Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, but most came from Côte d'Ivoire at 41%. The EU is a large coffee market. We know it accounts for almost 1/3 of the world's coffee consumption. And globally, the coffee export market is dominated by Brazil and Vietnam. So this is a really, really global trade area here. Now, overall, the EU agricultural import will be vulnerable to climate change for some major imported crops, such as cocoa and coffee, in the next 20 to 30 years, which suggests that immediate action is needed to prevent possible adverse effects. According to a recent study, approximately 28% of cocoa imports in 2050 will come from places that are very seriously threatened by drought. However, shipments from the Ivory Coast and Ghana are relatively less vulnerable to drought. On the coffee side, 44% of coffee import supply locations will be highly vulnerable to drought due to climate change. So, with us today, we have three excellent panelists to talk about these particular areas and how EU sustainability policy might be affecting this really vast global supply chain that I just described. Here with us today, we have Paulo de Castro, a member of the European Parliament, who sits on the Committee on Agriculture and Rural Development and the Committee on International Trade. We have Rodrigo Lima, Partner Director of Agrocone in Brazil, and Dr. Rethana Pugh Norbert Munz, Climate Foresight and Scenarios Development Expert at the FAO. Welcome to all three of you, and thanks for joining us on this panel. Mr. de Castro, let's start with you. In terms of the European Parliament's work in this area, how has the European Parliament thought about possible unintended consequences when crafting the laws that are now being set in sustainability and agriculture?
Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you to Elo and all the friends that invite me in this very interesting roundtable. And thank you very much for my professor, Alan Matthew, which is a very good friend of mine. And I appreciate the speech that he's already done. Thanks a lot. This is a very, very important task. I mean, how we can mix the Green Deal, the farm to fork strategy with the trade policy, which is quite a very important achievable business for European countries. And this is what we talk always in Agriculture Committee in the European Parliament. But let me say some points of my thoughts, and then I will try to say something in the conclusion. First of all, let me remind you that, of course, European Union is the world's biggest importer and exporter of agri-food products in the world. So the world needs more food, and the European Union has the duty to contribute to the global food security, not only to transition to more sustainable food system. We have to realize that we play one of the most important play in the world about this. The European Union can use our position as a major global player to set the benchmark and international standards for food system, based on respect for human and labor rights, fair competition, environmentally competition. So we need to develop an open strategic autonomy for the European Union to ensure access to key market and reducing dependency of import of critical goods, such as plant-based protein, source of fertilizers. So strengthening the trade aspect of the Green Deal and the farm to fork strategy to ensure consistently with our trade policy and make European Union standards respect also by third country with no regression, safeguard and mirror clauses. Yes, this is very, very important objective. But this is the point, because when we talk about the farm to fork strategy in our committee, one of the key points is we don't want to translate farm to fork strategy in an increase of European import, because of course we want to keep our potential production in Europe, but at the same time we want to increase the standards. We want to increase the environmental standards, we want to increase the sanitary standards, and we want to increase the animal welfare standards. So the trade-off is very, very complicated. How we can combine such important goals, such important result for the future, at the same time don't make our producer under the pressure to be completely out of the market. And this is what we appreciate very much, you know, the pressure, as Alan said, about the French presidency, when the French presidency in the agriculture issue put very much importance to the reciprocity. Reciprocity is one of the key of the question that we are talking about. So how we can be strong enough to be sure that our standard, our high level of environmental inequality can be respected by the country who export in Europe. But at the same time, we know that the question of the relationship between the third country is quite complicated, because we want to help this country to increase, develop. We want to help this country to continue to maintain at the European level an important role in the market. When we establish everything but harms programs, this is one of the key of the European strategy, of the European policy, to help this country to increase their export in Europe. So today we have an important trade-off to take a look. From one hand, we want to be sure that the European standard will be spread around the world, and we can be strong enough to be respected from the third country. But at the same time, we need to help this country to increase these environmental standards, these animal welfare standards, to don't create a sort of distortion in the European market. Distortion by allow producers to go into the European market without following the same rules. I know that there are some important concrete steps ahead in this direction. French Minister de Normandie, he said in our committee debate that the antibiotic resistant was one of the probably key result of the French presidency, to be able to respect the same European rules on the use of antibiotics for animal production. This is one of an important step, of course, but it's not the only one. I'm not really an expert on cocoa and coffee, but I understand that one of the important result of the European legislation for this country, for example, is the result of the European directive against unfair trading practices. That was an important task for the country, for the third country, where they have some problems with European retailers in the selling. So I want to say that European is working a lot to try to help this country to achieve this result and to help to have a good market in Europe. But at the same time, we need to maintain this balance between our producers, our standards, and the respect of these standards for the other country in the world. So even when we talk about carbon border adjustment mechanism or other policy, Fit for 55, or other policy that Alan Matthews was mentioned, yes, this is an important goal for us. And we are trying to stress as much as we can, as we have done with the Common Agricultural Policy Reform, pushing our farmer to continue to work into ensuring as much as they can the environmentally standards. And the eco scheme we introduce and a lot of constraint pushing our farmers in the right direction. The question is how we can achieve this result inside of the European market, inside of European producer, and we don't have any evidence of the reciprocity in our other countries that you export in Europe. So this is the trade-off, this is the complication that we have to face. And just to conclude some point, we say at the beginning, we don't want to have at the end of the Farm to Fork strategy just a more dependence of the European market from a third country. But at the same time, of course, we need to remember that the food security is an important issue for all of us, because we know that the increasing of demand, in particular in Asia, is pushing a lot the land grabbing phenomena and other phenomena to go to reach as much as they can the natural resources in the world, which are scarce. So I think European institution has to pay attention, to have a good balance of this policy. From one hand, to reach the important goals from the environmental side and from the animal welfare side, but at the other items to help farmers to reach this important achievement. Otherwise, without farmers, we don't achieve this result, and we don't get for the consumer a good result, because I don't know if all the imports are with the same standards that we produce. So the final question is how we can use and help farmers to help in this transition time and to help them to reach these goals without having a pressure from unfair competition by other countries in the world. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Paolo. So I think have Carla back. We're just going to try to bring her back in because we think we have the connection restored. Carla, we're going to try, and then if it doesn't work, what I might suggest is that you try just turning off your video. Sometimes that we can just get an audio, but let's try it and see how it works. Go ahead, Carla.
Many thanks, Dave. But you are started the panel, so let me just focus on this panel one moment. And what I wanted to say, I was beginning, and very sorry to have lost the connection, but what I was saying is, of course, that building a sustainable food system, it's crucial for the European Green Deal, and this will imply, of course, really transformational change in the way we produce and we consume. But it's also, to go very fast, it's also very clear for us that to achieve this ambition, that it's a global challenges, we need to work together hand in hand with our partner countries. So it's clear, it's true that will be impact, will be ramification of the Green Deal architecture and impact on this with the partner countries. But what I wanted to say that it's also clear that the European Union stands ready to support the partner countries towards this green transition, using all the stakeholders that just our parliamentary mentioned. Just let me take the example. We're in the panel of the cocoa. So let me just taking the example of cocoa to explain a little concretely in which way we want to work to support this agri-food system transition globally. And I take an example of the cocoa because, as you know, we have launched 1 year ago the Sustainable Cocoa Initiative to just improve the sustainability of the cocoa value chain in Western Africa, especially in Ghana and in Cote d'Ivoire, because they account for 65% of the world's production. Now, what we want to achieve following the Green Deal? It's the triple sustainability, the environmental sustainability. So this implies stop deforestation to produce cacao. The social sustainability, this implies halting harmful labor practices, such as child labor or forced labor. The third element, the sustainability, is the economic dimension, because it is we care about the economic dimension and the livelihood. So this is imply guaranteeing a living income to cocoa farmers in producing countries. So where in this case, what we want to do, it's really, we want to work on the sustainable cocoa, moving from the price to farmers and to the sustainability of the production. Now, to do this, we organize what we called the Cocoa Talks. So we hosted the dialogue at the European level with all the key stakeholders, industry, traders, farmers, NGOs, member states, partner countries. We have had this talk in Europe and in the countries. And all this dialogue during 1 year have shown that the European Union objective on sustainability is also a objectives that are very well aligned with the objective of the producing countries. Now, we have, just to mention, 2 legislative work on the European Union on due diligence that we know are of particular importance. When we look to this regulation, we will introduce a regulation on deforestation and forest degradation. That it's a regulation that was adopted in November 2021, and we have an upcoming EU Sustainable Corporate Governance Regulation. All these regulations will represent, of course, a decisive step to ensure more transparency, more traceability for the EU consumer, and will also support the improvement of condition of production in partner countries, and as well as the traceability, the monitoring system. What I wanted to say that, of course, this regulation will be there to answer to the due diligence that it's important for the sustainability of the production, but will also be an opportunity to upgrade, together with our partner countries, the cocoa production system. So the work that we will do is to use all our EU instruments, could be the trade agreement, but also all the instruments from the international cooperation, to work with Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana in order to stop deforestation, to combat child labor, to develop harmonized regional standards for sustainable cocoa, and essentially to put in place the transparent and efficient national cocoa traceability system that will be required by the new regulation. So, of course, I can say that there will be impact, but we want to use all the instruments of the international partnership in order to work with our partners, helping them in this transition towards sustainability, using policy dialogue, our development cooperation, and also our trade instrument. And as the parliamentary De Castro already mentioned, policy dialogue will be an essential to establish a partnership on sustainable cocoa with the FERTE countries, and of course, our international cooperation and the new engagement will also enhance a sustainable cocoa production and facilitate the compliance with the both public sector and the private sector into the new regulation. So it's clear that the challenges are huge, but of course, we will do what will be possible in order to mitigate the potential negative externalities through policy work, policy dialogue, and the development cooperation, and using the trade instrument to facilitate the green transition also with our partner countries. So the challenge is there. We want a radical change in the way we consume and we produce. This is the only way to face the climate challenges case, but of course we understand very well the impact on our partner countries, and we will be there in order to ensure to support them on being compatible with the new EU standards. Many thanks, and so sorry for my connection. I just keep a more focus on the discussion on the current panel in order to help you to move in the agenda of the meeting. Many thanks, Dave.
Great, thanks a lot, Carla. Perfect connection that time. Really, really important to get the Commission's standpoint on this. So thank you so much for reconnecting. So now let's go to Rodrigo back into the panel. So Rodrigo, I'd like to get your perspective on the wider impacts of EU policy globally, particularly for coffee and cocoa. What are the impacts, particularly coming from your perspective from Brazil?
Thanks so much, Dave and Professor Allen, for your presentation, which is really interesting. It's a pleasure to be here and join this very relevant conversation about the EU Green Deal impacts on food systems. And I'm from Brazil, and of course, Brazil is a big producer of several different agricultural products. Those EU Green Deal policy, different strategies and policies is quite relevant. When it comes to coffee and cocoa, but I will stay with coffee. I will say that first, it is very interesting to see when we think about coffee. There's the International Trade Center has a mapping of the different standards applied on different products, and there's 316 different standards applied to coffee worldwide, at least from this ITC baseline. 316. So imagine coffee producers trying to comply with different standards, because if I want to sell to someone and I do need to comply, I must meet the criteria there and so on. So what would be actually sustainability when it comes to coffee? Who defines sustainability? If the EU is asking for some specific requirements, the EU is defining, and then the producers doesn't know what to follow actually, because I need to comply with several different standards, and there's costs associated with this. Then there's the Global Coffee Platform that actually connects the different stakeholders of the coffee market, trying to find a balance between those standards. There's the equivalence mechanism, the Global Coffee Platform created to try to get to this minimum level playing field for the coffee producers. So one of the big issues when it comes to different private standards, and the EU asked for the private standards because it wants to get to higher standards of production, and one of the biggest challenges is with small producers. The smaller areas by each producers gets harder to engage into those processes and to pay for the cost of those processes, because not necessarily those standards mean and really bring a premium price over the baseline price, right? So this is one of the biggest issues when it comes to the adoption of the standards, especially when we have plenty of different standards to be followed. So the other aspect that I think it's really relevant, it's that the idea of transformational change of food systems, it is extremely relevant to define what does it mean, this transformational change. For example, when the EU is really engaged, and Brazil itself engaged, different countries are engaged, considering their views and their realities on climate change, for example. And I was at Glasgow conference last year, and on a presentation, someone mentioned that we live a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis and a soil crisis. And someone raised their hand and said, I think we live a development crisis, not just climate and biodiversity, for example. So what does it mean, a transformational change to food systems, considering the realities of different countries and the realities of producers within the EU as well? I think it's very important from a developing country perspective to highlight that the Common Agricultural Policy allows subsidies to the EU producers to adopt several different measures and practices receiving subsidies, and developing countries usually doesn't have this capacity to support their producers to adopt. There's the cross-compliance requirement, which is very fair, actually, but different countries doesn't have this capacity to do that. So how to level the standards about producing sustainably and consumption sustainably in a way that will allow a transformation of change, looking towards the SDGs, interconnected, because we cannot just see SDG 2 or 12, but we need to tackle SDG 1, that is eradicating poverty. And standards per se, when they are applied, simply I require the standard, and if you don't comply, you don't sell. You will create impacts, especially to small producers and to least developed countries. And this is something that, in my perspective, the EU cannot simply, does not take into account within their policies to face the challenges, to transform food systems as a multilateral perspective, not just a EU perspective. So I think it's not easy, but yes, of course, I think all of we here, we deal with complex issues and agendas, and I think dialogue is one of the most important ways of really transforming lives and moving forward And just to sum up here, I think Professor Allen mentioned some criteria to the policy coherence at the conclusions and recommendations of his study. And Professor, I would add one criteria to the policy coherence, that is equivalence. Equivalence between what the EU wants and what I do. It's something that should be pursued, because ultimately some country is producing not necessarily following all of the EU requirement, but there's some equivalence between what is being asked to achieve environmental protection, GHGs emissions reduction, and some other aspects are at the core of the EU policy objectives. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Rodrigo. I think some really key points there about the impact that these policies can have globally. Let's go next to Rathana. So Rathana, what would you say is the intersection between climate policy on one hand and global food systems on the other, particularly for coffee and cocoa beans?
Thank you, Dave. And thank you, Professor Allen, for the research inside and extremely timely to bring those kind of research looking really about the global impact of the EU Green Deal. The question I have today is really interesting. If I may say, it's actually fundamental, and that really need to be better understood and addressed. There is just more than one single intersection between climate policy and global food system, and all deserve equally to be discussed, especially when we are looking at those two perennial crops, coffee and cacao, that became a part of daily routine, not only in the EU, but globally. Millions of people are drinking coffee, are eating chocolate, not only at the EU, but in Asia, in Africa, in America. There are multiple markets for those crops. From that very elite consumption that we had in the 17th century to a very global phenomenon that we have in the 21st century, the question you ask me, Dave, here is exactly what could climate policy change, regulate, promote, or transform? And that's for many people that are coming from an agriculture point of view. They will be looking at, okay, what? Again, a new type of policy, a new type of branding of things that can change the world and bring sustainability. So before I start to address really that questions, allow me to step back and start defining the global food system as production, processing, and distribution of the food throughout the world. And I think it's very important because when we talk about coffee and cacao, producers are not in Europe, producers are outside Europe. Yes, processing, retailing, distributions are mainly from companies that are in Europe or in America. So now, when I ask you to just think about all of the steps that allow you this morning or this afternoon to have your coffee cup, can you all have a view of the right selections of the coffee variety, the planting of your seed, the type of harvest? Because I mean, coffee will take 3 to 4 years because you can have before having a flower. The sherry processing, the drying method, the milling, the roasting. Let's not forget, of course, the packaging, the branding, the trading. Like cacao, coffee require a highly intensive food process. So when we're talking about coffee and cacao and the intersection that could be with the climate policy, we really have to bring all of the elements of the food system. And when I say all of the elements, is all of the stakeholders across the food system, not only the producer, not only the consumer, but all of those different steps that make your coffee available this morning. So as my colleague and Rodrigo points, was very interesting as well, because yes, it's a complex, it's a dynamic system. But what could we bring today? We can look at different drivers of change, and those drivers of change are extremely important. Yes, they vary from regions and country, but in general, those most important that we have to really think today is really about population's growth, changing diets, climate change, of course, global pandemic implications like COVID-19, and how those key dynamics and intersection are demonstrating the food system as being one, and that global food system as being one. So looking back, and I'm based now in Asia for the last 10 years, one of the key drivers of change is really rapid urbanizations, middle class growth, change of diets. Many of you know, and I think that we are more than 600 people now in this call. Yes, EU is one of the largest chocolate market. I think it's #1, but the fast growing one is in Asia. Food demand, and previous speaker were talking about it, food demand is expecting to increase anywhere between 59% to 98% by 2050. This will shape in the EU, but globally, agriculture market in ways we have never seen before. So who is going to really pay the burden, the competitiveness of that food system? So I work a lot on climate change, and allow me, maybe for some that are not really familiar about the impact of climate change, and maybe taking one of the example really from Asia and from Laos. The growing impact of climate change is extremely important in general for any sectors, but especially for the agriculture sector. In Asia, the agriculture workforce is about 350 million smallholder farmers, with 80% of the food that is being consumed that are being produced by those ones. And I think this is a very important point here. In Asia, when we think about the food system and when we think about the food baskets, thinking about climate risk, talking about vulnerability of those countries, it's talking about the vulnerability and the risk of major food grain baskets. I know that for coffee, yes, we're far away from being Brazil, but in Vietnam, in India, or in Indonesia, we're a key producer, and we will represent 28% of the total production in the world of coffee, for example. One of the things that is very important here is that both cacao and coffee are sensitive to climate. Yes, all of the different crops are, but one of the recent research states that rising temperature will reduce up to 50% of the area suitable of coffee production by 2050. Now, saying that is, are we going to change our consumption of coffee? Are we going to reduce our coffee consumption? If coffee is not a crop that is suitable, if coffee is a type of crop that is not or too much climate sensitive, are we looking at alternative? Recent work that I have was in Laos, and I don't know if for some of you know that, you know, in Vietnam and in Laos, you might just have the kind of the same context, mainly related to the mountainous area. And Laos was expressing really like the willingness to produce more, to be more competitive, and to produce more coffee. Now, if I look at the EU Green Deal, and I will look at like future green partner in Asia, my questions will be directly, how are we going to assist them? What type of capacity are we going to build? What type of climate informations, what type of climate data or analytic can really allow producer country to better address those future change? And how could we, and I say really we as being a global food system, how could we look at resilient, sustainable agricultures of crops that are actually climate resilient? So climate policy of today, and I do really insist on that, have this very unique space to shape the future of the food system. It's addressing both the climate risk, the greenhouse emission, the adaptations, and could really identify opportunity. So my final work here is really like, as much as we are looking at future partner, as much as we're looking at how we're going to build capacity of those countries to provide more, better, higher quality, better safety of food-related items, we have to look at as well new area, new region, new country where those kind of food could be produced. And again, I relate to the points from my two previous speakers and really the points of Rodrigo. There is a major part of that EU Green Deal that need to focus about what are the future capacity in order to achieve the EU Green Deal. And that capacity and that discussions about the capacity needs to go beyond techniques related just to producing more, but producing better and in better area. That's all for me. So thank you, Dave.
Thanks a lot. We have a question related to that final point you were making that I'm going to put to you in just a second. That's from the audience. But first, I want to go to a first question from the audience. This one is for Paolo. So the question comes from Alan Jones. He asks, how will social issues and working conditions be included in future agricultural trade agreements, particularly important now that the Common Agricultural Policy foresees social conditionality rules for EU farmers, a level playing field? According to the EU Strategy on Safety and Health at Work, the Commission will foster occupational safety and health in global supply chains and companies operating in low and middle income countries. So Paolo, obviously you're very active in CAP and international trade. What would you say to that question?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the question, because the social dimension was one of the most innovative and interesting points in the CAP reform. We are always involved in the environmental issue, in the economic issue, but we lose sometimes the social dimension. And it should be clear that, of course, all the European farmers has to follow the labor regulation, the safety regulation, to receive direct payment from farmers. You know, it should be normal. But normally it's not like this. So we have a lot of cases in different member states that they don't respect the law, but they still receive help from European Union. So we introduced the social conditionality as a new conditionality to be sure that we don't have a distortion between farmers in the European Unions who respect and who don't respect. It's not only an ethical question, but is I think it's even an economic question. It's an important result from the human, right and then all the discussion about that. Of course, when we have to translate the social dimension to the international trade, the situation has become more complicated. It's exactly what we have said before. You know, how we can achieve this result. Well, we are trying to do a lot of new legislation in this direction. For example, the new European legislation against the forced label. The forced label is an important new piece of legislation which are working for. And I think that would be a lot of attention at the European level to do that. So we want to be sure that the product we import respect the labor, the human right and the labor right, in particular for children and of course now we are in the situation of which for the first time it's not only the title but it's something on concrete legislation. But I very much hope that this kind of attention will go much more in deep in the future than what we have already done. Thank you.
Thanks, Paolo. So the next question is for Rodrigo. This question is from Bettina Rudloff. Putting the Green Deal's trade links into the broader trade strategy perspective, do you think the sustainability and standard setting approach fits into the generally more geostrategic, proactive, fighting and unilateral trade approach of the EU? And is there a general trade-off of weakening multilateralism? What do you think about that, Rodrigo?
It's a very good question. My first point is that at the multilateral level, the definition at the multilateral level, trying to combine trade and sustainable development. We have the WTO and all the issues related to the WTO reform and how sustainable development issues are regulated or should be regulated from a trade perspective. Then we have the UNFCCC, for example, addressing climate change, the CBD negotiations going on to get to the COP15, for example, to define the new biodiversity targets framework for the post-2020. And so what I see is that defining what is sustainability in terms of different producing chains from a multilateral perspective is extremely complex, extremely challenging to get to a level playing field that everyone agrees with core principles and criteria to define and agree that this is the way forward. So what happens now is that the private sector, the markets, the financial markets, with all the ESG complex universe moving on, what is happening is that unilaterally or groups of stakeholders get together to define what is for them, what is sustainable for them. And I require this when I'm buying from you, because ultimately I'm exposed to the market, I'm exposed to the consumers, I'm exposed to different constituencies. So, and what I see is that, and this is, I think this is very, very normal on these complex issues, especially when you need to have an agreement between a multilateral perspective. But this creates something interesting from an international law perspective. That is, the states ultimately are adopting what they want as criteria, and the fact that the states cannot enforce what they want abroad creates a huge gap. And the way to fill this gap is to promote the standards, because the standards are private, in some cases with the support of states, like the case of the biofuels standards of the EU directive, for example. And in my view, I'm an international lawyer, so I'm thinking with a legal perspective here. I tend to believe that the states are those private standards ultimately are being managed unilaterally or bilaterally or by multi-stakeholder groups, and the states, the countries use them, or at least wants the standards to accomplish what they want as their regulations. This is complex, but you know, it's very easy to see that when we look to a figure of 316 different standards just for coffee. There's one mapping of the European. There's one website, I don't remember, for different agricultural products, and if we want to check how many standards are today for agriculture as a whole, it's really a big and complex puzzle. And if I don't follow your standard, I can sell to you. If I follow Paolo's standards, I can sell to Paolo. If I follow Hatana, I can sell to her. But when I get to small producers again, this becomes something not possible to operate. So in my view, again, I think we as a civilization, we live at the challenge of how to transform food systems into more sustainable standards and patterns. recognizing the challenges of different countries, their ability to access technology, their ability to access and implement practices and good practices, and their credit policies, and their cooperation with different countries in terms of technology, for instance. All the climate change debate, when I look to what is being discussed at the Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture at the UNFCCC, and the FAO has a very important work on this, relates to innovation, technology adoption, capacity to adopt the technology, money and technology to make this happen according to different countries' perspectives, realities, and so on. So in my view, if the approach is to create more standards, and not to have at least minimum equivalence about what is, we will, producers, including the EU, will need to face the different standards and the costs of the different standards, remembering that a premium price, it's for coffee there's premium price, but the premium price it's almost nothing. So the smallest ones will not be able to accomplish this, and probably will face trade restrictions. Thank you.
Thanks, Rodrigo. So Rathana, we have a question from the audience for you that I think relates somewhat to what you were saying about coffee and possible changes in production and consumption patterns. The question comes from Nicholas Kockelman. He says, cocoa is not vital, but rather it's a luxury product for Europeans. However, it is vital for the income of farmers and workers in the sector. Yet in Europe, organic chocolate is more or less 1% of the chocolate market, and child labor is still an issue on cocoa plants. Is cocoa a viable business model in terms of fairness and sustainability, or should businesses focus on producing food in Africa rather for regional consumption?
It is a very challenging question. And again, I think everyone can hold different opinions, and we can always continue to debate about how much global food system should be actually regional or even national food system in order to really address the specificity of different country, a different crop, different food, different culture, different process of consumption. Now, we're in 2022, and just coming back to what was 17th century, it's not going to happen in one day neither. And when we think about the transition is not just the diet, it's the people behind. And that people, yes, are the producer. And those producers can be millions of people. So what type of alternative livelihood are we going to provide them? Not talking only about the producer then, what about those land? Those land that are producing that? What are we going to envision in terms of future land use? Will it be better to have tobacco? Will it be better to have coffee? Who is going to decide that trajectory? Land is one of our key resources. And when we talk about agriculture, we definitely talk as much as people behind and money behind, we talk about the future of the land use. And I think that the question is it's very challenging. And it is very difficult because every country will have different approach of land use planning and will have different view and visions of the future they want and the food they want, right? It doesn't mean that those food and the way we produce cannot be changing. Food have been changing, food system have been changing. Now, how do we trigger that transformation that it will be inclusive enough? I'm not saying fully inclusive. Like I forgot to be naive like a long time ago. It's finished. No. How in reality can we provide to that complex solution trigger of change, transformation pattern? And yes, I agree. It is about access to technology. It is access to finance. It's about infrastructure. It's about market access. It's about the energy. What type of energy are going to fuel those future food, and how are we going to transport it? Because the biggest fight right now is really climate change. And when we talk about the EU Green Deal, we have to really talk about the future low emission or decarbonization pathway of the agriculture. This is really one of the key things to discuss. So I hope that I respond partly to the person. I'm sorry if I cannot go more into personal opinion, but I don't think it's the place either. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. Sounds like a good answer to me. It's so much to talk about here with these particular staples, but we do have to move on to our next panel. So I want to thank all three of you for some really interesting insights there. So let's move on to the next panel, which is going to be focused on dry fruits, nuts, and pulses. So a little bit of background information here. The EU is the second largest market for pulses in the world after Asia. In contrast to stable or declining pulses trade in the United States, Africa, and Asia, Europe's trade value in 2020 was higher than in the previous year. Over 5 years, the European pulses market has grown by more than 27%. And the import cost of pulses from growing international locations may be very strong and commonly makes up about 50% of the non-European supply. Now, the numbers for dried fruit and nuts are also quite good. The import outlook within Europe is positive in the long term, and it's expected that imports will continue to increase in the coming years. Since 2013, the total European imports of edible nuts and dried fruits have grown annually by 9% in value, reaching 11.3 billion in 2017. So to talk about how the EU's sustainability policies will affect the global supply chain and the trade in these items, let's move to our, let me introduce our next panelists. So we have with us here today, Anna Bolova, Secretary General of FRUCOM, which is the Federation of Dried Fruit, Edible Nuts, Processed Fish, Processed Fruits and Vegetable Traders. We have Lynn Fortin, Agriculture Counselor at the Canadian Mission to the EU. And we have Okisegere Ojepat, CEO of the Fresh Produce Consortium in Kenya. Welcome to all of you. Anna, let's start with a question for you. What would you say are the possible unintended consequences you've noticed from the perspective of European traders in dried fruit and nuts?
Thank you very much, Dave. I hope everybody can see and hear me. Yeah, okay, perfect. So thanks for introducing the association. And before I go into the question of unintended consequences, I think I would like to make a very brief introduction for the businesses we represent, because it's not maybe obvious from the start. So for some foodstuffs, such as dried fruit and nuts, the EU imports a very large share of products. For example, the world leader in almonds is California. In hazelnuts, it is Turkey. In pistachios, the US, Turkey, and Iran. In dried apricots, raisins, and sultanas, it is Turkey. So for most of these products, there is European production as well, but it's not sufficient to meet the market needs. So as Dave pointed out, the market is growing, the imports are growing into Europe, and so is the production. And I would like to echo what Abhi just put in the chat box. The imports are complementary to the EU farming. They are necessary for the competitiveness of the EU food industry and to guarantee supplies to the consumers. So for that reason, we work a lot with the origin countries, and the imports must meet the EU food safety standards, and this is stipulated in the European legislation. So that's a little bit about the business environment and where we are positioned. Secondly, to answer your question in terms of the impact of farm to fork and maybe unintended consequences, we don't really do the economic modeling studies in FRUCOM, but I can refer to the two studies which I think many of the participants would be familiar with, and this is by the USDA Economic Research Service and by Wageningen. So the first one has pointed out on the negative impact on the EU prices, on production, on imports and exports, on farm income, and also pointed to the effects on third countries. Moreover, when I was listening to the speaker, to the expert from that research service presenting at the European Parliament end of January, he quoted that the growth in productivity between 9 and 27 years to meet the farm to fork targets would be necessary. That's quite impressive. The Wageningen experts pointed out the reduction of yields in Europe between 7 and 40%, depending on the crop in the country. But of course, there are other expert opinions that would be contrary to those. So I just wanted to present the different views. Now, regarding the pesticides, as I see quite a few questions on this in the box, I would quote DG Santo official. Of course, everybody has seen the new plans of the EU for the pesticide policy under the Green Deal, and in particular, the reduction in the use of pesticides by 50%. Now, when we talk about the taking into account the environmental criteria, in particular for the protection of the bee population, for the neonicotinoids, the EU will lower MRLs and not allow import tolerance. And same for another class of chemicals such as persistent bioaccumulative and toxic substances. Concretely, according to DG Santo official, these would be 4 substances in total. So this is based on what we heard from DG Santo back in June, but we will see, of course, how the policy will evolve and what will be the final conclusion. Now, the last week, the European Commission, as many of you no doubt have seen, has launched a call for evidence regarding the application of environmental standards on imports. And so I participated in this meeting set up by DG Sante among the other 90 people or so from different food associations, and the participants voiced concerns about the legitimacy of the EU taking unilateral action, about enforceability, the possible backlash by exporters, WTO compatibility, scientific justification, and so on. So basically, the report is not yet out. It's expected in June, and we will contribute to the consultation as PRUCOM, and we will, of course, see what is going to be retained in the report in there, and take it from there. But I think once we've highlighted some of the possible consequences, of course, based on some of the opinions, the key question for me would be, okay, we work for PRUCOM, we work for the industry and the trade, and what can the industry PRUCOM represents do, and what it is being done already, quite concretely, to mitigate the impact. So first of all, and that's the traditional role of a trade association, we work with source countries and our European and UK members to make sure that suppliers are informed in advance of all the changes in the EU legislation so that the EU standards continue to be met. And we follow closely the upcoming changes and underline the need for sufficient transition time. And here I repeat again my plea back in June, and also what Professor Matthew said, we need sufficient transition time for the operators to adapt in case of any change, of course. And then in terms of the environmental standards, I would like to just say that, you know, using as little as possible of all agricultural inputs, be it water, be it fertilizers, be it pesticides, not only it can be regulated, and it is regulated in certain countries. For example, in California, which has one of the most stringent standards from the environmental perspective, but this also makes business sense. So we have a very active sustainability working group in PRUCOM, and we run quite actively the information on LinkedIn. I invite you to have a look at this if you wish, for specific examples on specific products such as almonds, walnuts, pistachios, dried fruits. So there are many of those mentioned there. You are very welcome to have a look. And I think such a good practice should be recognized by the EU when it embarks on sustainability initiatives. And here I echo what Rodrigo said about equivalency, the need of equivalence and recognition of business initiatives. And 2 last points, I think. The EU is planning legislation on sustainable food labeling in 2024, and it has been working on the methodology since almost 10 years now. But before the legislators even started on that, the EU supermarkets have already rolled out or are testing such labeling already. So we are looking at this very closely. And finally, Farm to Fork puts emphasis on plant-based products in terms of nutrition. So because our products have a great nutritional value, we will continue to explore benefits and challenges together with the scientific experts from EU and elsewhere, together with the European Commission, of course, and our partners in the food chain. So basically, let me conclude by saying that I think whatever the challenges are coming, it's the survival of the fittest. And we need to take initiative, and we need to get prepared, and we need to take the best action we can to make sure that we are well fit for the future, to do the best we can in that regard. Thank you very much again for having me here, and looking forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. Let's go to Lynn next. So we've heard a lot about how the effects might be felt in Africa, in South America, in Asia. We haven't talked so much about North America yet. So Lynn, let's go to you for that perspective. How has or will Canada be affected by these EU policies, particularly when it comes to these products, dry fruits, nuts, and pulses?
Thank you very much, Dave, and hello, everybody. Canada is an important producer of pulses, and we've actually, both in the private sector and in terms of the research and government support, been really pushing to increase that particular type of crop because it is a very good and healthy source of nutrients, and also we can produce it quite competitively in Canada. So I'll just start off by saying that I do work for the Government of Canada, but I do not personally hold a monopoly on the Government of Canada's official position on specific trade matters. But with that disclaimer, I'm happy to share some of my thoughts based on my experience. So I'll share with you some views from the perspective of an export-oriented country with important economic and political and cultural ties with Europe. First, we need to be clear that we're starting from a premise that international trade is overall a desirable thing. It's been good to see in the comments that most people seem to be on board with that, at least in this panel, because sometimes there's a tendency to go off in a different tangent. So the objective of this trade is to provide economic growth, opportunity, as well as a broader choice of goods and services to consumers worldwide. In the case of agriculture, trade can contribute to better health outcomes by increasing the variety and affordability of nutritious products available to consumers. It can also contribute to a greater quality of life by introducing new options that are pleasurable to consumers who can afford such luxuries. Fine chocolates, for example, somebody was mentioning earlier. All of these objectives are legitimate. There are others that could be added. I mean, you could make a case that in some cases, for some crops, it may be beneficial to the environment that they can be grown in a particular part of the world where the pressure on the environment in that context is less, and that they can then export those products elsewhere. Canada and European Union member states have benefited greatly from the advantages we've negotiated in the Canada-EU Economic and Trade Agreement, the CETA. In both directions, trade has grown. This is something that we want to continue to build on both sides. We are longstanding, trusted, and reliable trading partners. Our production and our exports are largely complement each other, and this is true even in the fraught world of agriculture and food. Canadians enjoy drinking wine and eating fine chocolates from Europe, and Europeans like having Canadian blueberries and maple syrup on their pancakes. So I think we can all agree, however, that trade policy and trade agreements are not panaceas that can solve all the problems in society. And I think we touched on that in the previous panel. Health, social, environmental policies, and a panoply of other types of government action play key roles in determining the real outcomes in a particular country. What Mr. Matthews addresses in his paper, seems like a long time ago now, but in his paper when he presented to us, and what the EU is putting on the table with some of its recent proposals, is to expand the role of trade in order to harness it to help us reach some key societal objectives. So here, we're focused largely on climate and environmental objectives, but the Farm to Fork strategy itself also identifies health, nutrition, fair remuneration for farmers as key objectives. And Canada shares the objectives of the Farm to Fork strategy. Let me repeat that, Canada shares the objectives of the Farm to Fork strategy. The federal and provincial governments, our research community, and actors all along the Canadian agriculture and food value chain are working hard to make the production and supply of food to consumers more sustainable. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada is working with its provincial partners to implement our new strategy on sustainable agriculture as well. Funding has been made available at both the federal and provincial levels to promote innovation and assist farmers and food producers to implement more sustainable practices and to offer sustainable choices that consumers are increasingly demanding. This is all happening now, as it is in the European Union. So we shouldn't be discouraged. There's more work to do, but it has started. So fundamentally, there is no conflict or concern with the objectives laid out by the EU. Reducing the use of pesticides, taking action on antibiotic resistance, addressing important issues around deforestation. These are all supported in Canada and by Canada. Where there may be some questions that need to be raised is whether there's enough room being left to allow for flexibility needed to avoid trade disruptions. And just to be clear, I'm not referring to flexibility to have lower standards or flexibility to do harm to animals or the environment. I'm talking about flexibility in how to achieve the objectives behind the standards and what is required in each country to get there. And that will be different depending on the circumstances. Mr. Matthews lists several possible pitfalls in his study. And that is, I think, where we need to focus our discussions and our analysis. Regulations are good and necessary and trade facilitating. Anybody who works in trade policy will agree with that. A level playing field that reflects our best efforts to achieve positive outcomes is something we all strive for. However, there is the possibility of regulatory overreach. For Canadian exporters, being asked to meet high standards is nothing new. What they do ask, however, is that the regulatory framework for enforcing those standards be predictable, implementable on the ground, that they take into account the realities involved in production, transformation, and bringing products to the market. And that doesn't seem like an unreasonable thing to ask. This is especially true for small and medium-sized enterprises. We touched on that earlier as well. So I'll just end by saying that Canada has in place strong, well-established, and globally respected governance frameworks that ensure food safety and human, animal, and plant health are addressed as priorities, and we want those to be recognized. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency is a global leader in its field. Canada can work with our partners in the EU to find ways to make trade work while also achieving the objectives in the Farm to Fork strategy. This is perhaps a bigger challenge in some other countries. And with that, I'll give the floor to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lynn. Let's go next to Oki Segere from Kenya. Tell us a little bit about how Kenya will be affected by these EU policies when it comes specifically to these products.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of us based on where you are. I come to you from Nairobi, Kenya. I want to start by introducing myself a little more than just what has been introduced. Fresh Produce Consortium of Kenya is an association that brings together the value chain actors in the fresh produce industry, fruits, vegetable, herbs, spices, and flowers. And for this reason, therefore, our biggest trading partner is the EU for now. And for us, in terms of where we sit in Africa, unlike our colleagues in Canada, what we are dealing with is completely different. The challenges we have in Africa are different from the challenges that the Canadians are dealing with. The majority of our growers are smallholders that have up to less than an acre for them to be able to do their production, unlike tracts of lands elsewhere. The regulatory framework is growing by day. The incentives to get the growers to be able to really be able to manage their production sites to meet compliance criteria and be able to ensure that trade continues is an uphill task every day. We are coordinated in a totally different framework as compared to the rest of the world. And for us, when I hear of unintended challenges that we are looking at with the introduction of the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy, it's worrying for Africa, because the first thing we're looking at here is, whereas we are looking at trade, we are looking at sustainability. In Africa, most of the part, we're still looking at food security. And the focus, therefore, is on food security than just trade. And when you look at it, that we still have general populations that cannot be able to afford the next meal. And therefore, whereas we are pushing to see what we're going to do, every other change of regulation, particularly from the EU, affects our exports. Today, Kenya, where I sit, is the largest exporter of avocados into the EU and the rest of the world. We have grown, but I can tell you for free that every growth stage that we go through, every time there's a change of regulation in the EU, it hits us hard. We are looking at the way the changes are flowing, they're not flowing in tandem. Whereas the EU, in their thoughts, respecting their jurisdiction, decided It's time to look at the Green Deal. The question I have is, what went wrong? What necessitated the introduction of the Green Deal? And how have we worked to localize the Green Deal? Africa needs its own Green Deal to be able to negotiate equivalence, and not to look at a Green Deal looking like it's about, this is what the EU has decided, and this is what we are going to implement. The environment we're dealing with is completely different. Let me just make a comment when it comes to the issue of pesticide. When you talk about reduction of pesticide by 50%, we do not have a problem. Question is, can you give us the alternatives pesticide we're going to use? But are we just going to say we want to bring down pesticide by 50%, increase the organic growth by 20%? It's impossible to achieve that increase in Africa when it comes to organic production, because we are in the tropics. The pests that we are talking about in EU particularly are not, the pests we are talking about in Africa are not in EU. Even if they go to the EU, they will not be able to survive a season because of the weather patterns and the environment and the temperatures in EU. And for that reason, therefore, we are dealing with, we are in the tropics, and the challenges in the tropics are different. What we are basically saying, listen, the challenges that are there and the intention by the EU is good for EU. But question is, whereas EU farmers enjoying subsidy, are African farmers enjoying the same subsidy? Is there somebody working with the African farmers one stage at a time? Or are we being told, listen, it's time to implement and you want us to implement? I thought through the WTO, there's a framework to look at here. When a trading partner changes regulation, there's need to work with the other partner and bring the other partners on stage. And then see how we bring the changes that we bring in. Not by making it a barrier to trade, but seeing how to lift the other partners to a level where capacity building is done. For us, what Africa requires is capacity building to be able to move on. We can talk about technologies, for heaven's sake. How are we going to talk about technologies when the legislative framework is changing over and over and over, faster than what we are able to implement? The other question I have here is, so if EU says this is what they have, what happens if the rest of the world says no to the EU regulation? Is it because EU is the biggest bloc and can therefore dictate terms? Or is it because the EU is saying, listen, friends, whereas we are safeguarding our growers, this is what we are working to pull together the partners and seeing what we can do? Then, Dave, I want to ask a very strong question. At the point of this discussion, is Africa on the table? Who is on the table? How are we discussing? How are we localizing it? Who is advising? Who is looking at the African content and looking at the growing systems? I'm glad what I've heard from my friend Rodrigo and what I've also heard from Ramada. When you're looking about cocoa, you're looking about coffee. Kenya produces coffee. Today, we're struggling with our coffee because we're still selling our coffee beans instead of value-added coffee. So we're already having a challenge here because our Kenyan coffee is used as a blend coffee elsewhere. So the challenges we're looking at here is we need to look at how do we support the African grower in where I see it and the other partners by the EU to ensure that compliance is achieved objectively and be able to say we are walking one step at a time and that we are advising each other and that we're not just sitting to make decisions because we must make decisions or make legislation because we must legislate or say, listen, we must do this because we're the biggest trading partner. Whereas we want to protect home, but there's an obligation to look at what our trading partners talk about. The world is about being together. Sustainability is about inclusivity. For us, it's about what you need for us. However small we contribute, what are we doing? Today, Africa supplies raw material. We are looking at avocado now giving us avocado oil and different products that will come in from the nuts, from the fruits that we have. We have gone up and increased the production of fruits. That is also going to help us to address the issues of environment, raising our forest cover, using fruit trees. That is the target. What are we going to do? Are we going to wake up in the morning, another 2 years or another 1 month, and here the EU has said, now it's either this or this. Can we negotiate? Can we discuss? Can we sit on the table Can we be accommodative? And can we support each other as we do this? And as we do legislation, remember, if we are now in a global village, we now have to look at issues of MRL, for example. Whereas we talk about interception, whereas all of us talk about compliance and talk about safety, question is, what are we doing as trading partners to ensure that we are all at the same level? As I come to the tail end, David, I want to say this. Whereas EU has gone through so much, Africa has not gone through any revolution. EU has gone through an agricultural revolution. Last time looking at the strategy in EU, agriculture is not on the main lane, on the main agenda. EU is looking about health, looking about migration, looking about this. Agriculture seems to be number 10 on the list. In Africa, food security is number 1 on the list. What are we doing? Even as we implement the Green Deal, even as we talk about farm to fork strategy, do we realize that we have not gone through any revolution in agriculture? Do we realize that we're struggling about food security? Do we realize that now, instead of talking about compliance, many people look at this, not an excuse of not complying, but we are saying, please, can we work together? Can we work together? Can we consult together? Can our voice be heard on the table as we do the planning? I submit. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. All some very good points, I think, there. I'm going to go to some questions from the audience now. So we've had a question for Anna from Bettina Rudloff. The question is, Anna, how do you evaluate specifically the expected new EU mandatory due diligence approaches on small farmers? Do you expect burdens on them, such as the cost for documentation, exclusion from the value chain due to concentration, losing income, need for new land areas, or other negative effects? What to do against such effects? What do you wish from the EU to accompany these new approaches to avoid such risks?
Thank you for the question. I hope you can hear me. I think we have to see what is in the upcoming proposal before we make any pronouncement on this. What I can also share with the audience that we have very closely followed the similar debate in the German context, because there the legislation ahead of the EU approach, and indeed, as they say, the devil is in the detail. So we know that our German members and counterparts had some worries about how this will be implemented. And again, the intention is a very positive one. And I would like to highlight that, of course, many companies do that. And we in Frucon, we also carry an assessment on different sustainability parameters, be it social, be it environmental, political risks, and so on. So we are looking at that very closely. But how is it going to be prescribed concretely? What sort of practical measures would be necessary? What sort of bureaucratic paperwork might be required? Who will bear the responsibility for anything going wrong? How much can you see? We in the EU we represent the importers. So basically, they depend. They are at the end of the chain, of the supply chain. That's why I always emphasize we work a lot with the supplying countries. So we try to anticipate things as much as we can. We try to collaborate, like Mr. Ojepat has mentioned. We try to collaborate with our supplying countries and partner associations in these countries as much as we can. Yet there is a limit, I think, as to how much can be asked from an SME in Europe, which is important, the final product, in terms of the commitments that they would take. But again, I would reserve the judgment till we see the draft when it comes out. So we will, and of course, I mean, the traders, they are in the specificity of the trades and businesses. You know, you have to adapt, and people will make the necessary adaptation, of course. But well, if I can make a wish, it would be for a reasonable proposal. Let us wait. I understand it's tomorrow, so we will see what comes our way. Thanks.
Indeed. Olga Segura, I wanted to put this question to you as well, because you talked about how so many of the farmers are smallholder farmers. What is your perspective on this? You're on mute.
As Anna has said, I think for me, what is critical is that we must be practical in whatever we do. And we must just be very practical and real. We'll be able to say, as she says, if a proposal is coming out tomorrow, can we look at it? and be able to reason and analyze and be able to critique, hoping that we will be allowed, there will be room to negotiate and engage, not really negotiate, but to engage, so that we are able to say how this is going to serve all of us. So I think it's important that we wait to see what comes out tomorrow. As soon as that happens, let's sit together and let's be able to engage. For me, the most important thing is let's keep the engagement window open, and not always to imagine that we're putting a date to close it up, but just say how do we engage without having to compromise each other. Thank you.
Okay, we have a next question from the audience for Lynn. And Lynn, if you want to answer the previous question about small farmers as well, go for it. This is the specific question to you again from Bettina. What due diligence approaches relevant for food exist in Canada? As one German G7 priority is on fair value chains, what do you think can be done by cooperation between Canada and the EU and other G7 states on promoting positive effects of due diligence in agriculture and to avoid possible unintended negative effects, especially maybe for small farmers?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that question, so I will. There are due diligence mechanisms, statements in place for almost every agricultural product in Canada. The difference is the level of government oversight or intervention that's involved in setting up the standard or the whatever the due diligence statement is aimed at. I think, there's some areas that are more sensitive than others, but generally speaking, it runs a range from completely private sector initiative to, very heavily monitored and implemented with sort of a regulatory oversight by government. What the difference, I think, in Canada to the EU, though, is that we tend to work, the Department of Agriculture anyway, works very, very closely in what we call these roundtable value chain roundtables that we have. So in a lot of cases, the due diligence statements or the whatever you want to call them are developed in collaboration with industry players, we call it industry, with everybody along the value chain from farmers all the way to retail. And I think in terms of how we could collaborate with the EU or with other G7 partners, I think that there's definitely, even without a regulation in place, just by putting it out there and discussing it and issuing statements, governments can set a certain notional standard, if you will, or, here's what the desirable outcome is. And then, if companies are sort of not able to police each other or monitor each other, their reputation is going to suffer. I mean, I'm coming at this from a very North American perspective, which is at some point the market will speak. But you do at that point, allow things to sort of develop, I guess, in a more organic, not organic as in organic food production, but a more organic way. Yeah, I know everything's some sort of agriculture reference, no matter. And then I think also in terms of the issue about the smallholders in this context as well, I think for us, I think I saw something in the comments that was sort of alluding to this. I mean, you've got the big players who are largely able to make the investments and do what they need to do and measure and provide assurances. And then you've got, these smaller operators who maybe are going to take a little bit more time to get there, but really ultimately isn't what matters in something like climate change or something like biodiversity. What really matters ultimately is the aggregate impact. So do you really need to be, picking on every little thing that some poor little guy who's, got a very small production, maybe give him or her, sorry, I'm being very sexist to myself here, her a little bit more time, or they a little bit more time to get there. So I think that would be a way to help out some of the smaller players. And I mean, I think enough has been said by my colleagues here on the other question, and very well said.
So Lynn, as you referenced, there's a robust conversation going on here in the chats. I haven't had a time to fully look at it, but I did notice before there was a lot of talk about yields and whether some of these EU policies would affect agricultural yields. So Oke Segera, let me put this question to you. Do you think that some of these EU policies could lead to a reduction in agricultural yields outside of the EU? And then if that's the case, could changes in consumption make up for that?
Thanks, Dave. The truth is, if the Green Deal is implemented as proposed, as it is at the moment, cutting down the use of pesticide by 50% without giving alternatives is going to cut down our production by more than 80%. And that means we are going to be food insecure. And that means reduced trade, and that means we have to rely on imports, and that means then the revenue we are generating today, we're not going to generate it. So what I'm, just like I said, the critical thing is that we need to engage and say, whereas you're talking about cutting down the use of fertilizer, the use of pesticide, use of these particular molecules, and gladly earlier on, Matthew did speak about the MRL issues and the codex, just to look at the WTO and find out this. There's need to urgently for the EU to look at the tropics and look at how do we implement the Green Deal. As I said, what the Green Deal needs to be done is to be localized. Look at the context to ensure that we don't compromise on standards. We do not compromise on food security, but we ensure that compliance to global standards for us to be able to trade are key, and it's important. The world today talks about compliance, and compliance and food safety and standards is what everybody listens to. But listen, as I said earlier, the time comes and the time is now for us to be able to say, how do we handhold, support, even as we implement these factors? Let's look at the geographical side. For us, if it's implemented as it is, we are going to be importers. We're going to be more poor than we are today. We are going to kill people, the population, the young men and women. And we're going to go back to what I'm trying to run away from is, are we really trying to get more independent to see how Africa is going to be more food secure? Or is this going to affect those countries that are in the tropics? What's that going to happen? And this is going to be a trade barrier, because then we also have commitments that we need to do. And as I said again earlier, whereas EU has a right to protect and support their growers, they also have a role and a responsibility to work with the partners and find out how we work together. Just like Elena said, it's collaboration between themselves and the EU. I want to see a better framework of collaboration to say the do's and the don'ts and what kind of adjustments need to be done, considering, I repeat, that we come from the tropics and we get what the rest of the world doesn't cover. So in summary, what I'm saying here is that the Green Deal as it is, not good for Africa if it's implemented holistically as it is, but needs to be domesticated. We need to discuss, we need to evaluate, and we need them to be very clear. And then lastly, I want to say this, that let's put science. Let science guide every single step that we do, so that we don't throw science away and allow politicians to make decisions because they have to make decisions, but to say, scientists, where are we going? How are we proceeding? Just like we've given doctors an opportunity to speak about our health, let's allow the scientists to speak to us about food and entire food trade and safe trade to ensure that all of us have sufficient nutrients and food secure for the globe to continue. Then remember, Dave, whereas we are here, the world population today, particularly in Africa, is steadily going up. The available arable land is going down. So the need for science and technology to come in to be able to fill up that gap. If not, what do we do with the ever-growing population? I submit.
Anna, we have a kind of related question from the audience for you. This is from Walter Elberson. So note what you ask for, you may get. A lot of sustainability demands will lead to lower productivity per hectare, organic agriculture, lower emissions, etc. which has very negative effects on indirect land use change and thereby greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss. How will the EU assure solving one sustainability issue will not lead to another problem? And of course, you can't speak for the EU here, but what do you think from your perspective are the safeguards that are in place or should be in place for that?
Well, in one sentence, the safeguards would be to listen to the, let's say, the producers slash traders slash processors slash importers, etc. You know, to listen to the business realities of how things are happening. You know, there is a demand for organic agriculture. There is a sector that is growing, and of course, people producing organic products would embrace it very happily and develop this. But there is a certain limit in the market that will be reached at a certain point. So I think a degree of realism should be there. When I'm looking at all these targets, you know, 50% here, 25% there, etc., is this really done in coordination with the business community? I'm asking myself that question. I'm not quite sure about this. So I think at least I would welcome the fact that the EU is now willing to adhere to the stakeholders when they prepare this report, which is due in June. I hope that would be really an opportunity to be listened to. As Rathana mentioned earlier, you know, my naive days, I think, are gone. I'm not fully, you know, I'm not fully convinced this is exactly how it was going to happen. But you know, we can only try to do our best to respond to this consultation and try to advocate for the, let's say, the achievements and the realities in the countries to be taken into account. You know, I just want to say this. Many things on environmental level are done already. They are regulated already. This is happening. So, I mean, who's going to waste water? Who's going to waste fertilizers or pesticides if they can prevent it? I mean, people go for drip irrigation. People go for control of inputs. It's just business sense. Nobody wants to just waste things. And when there is an opportunity for organic produce, if that carries a premium, people would invest in that. It's a natural development, and that can be taken into consideration. It should be by the legislator, and this is something that the industry is quite proud of, you know. But things have to stay realistic, in my opinion, and we will see how it will work. There's a very concrete question of how that can be helped. At least I was pleased to see that it's a coordinated approach by DG Environment, Agriculture, Santa, etc. So that I hope that it will be more comprehensive point of view and that will be done in real consultation between the different directors general, so that there is more logic in the process. I really hope. Thank you.
Lynn, I want to put one last question to you before we wrap up. You mentioned before that Canada wants to be a partner with the EU on the Green Deal and sustainability. So Lisa Tostado asks, what could these green alliances look like in practice? So maybe really briefly, if you could just say when we look at such a green alliance between the EU and Canada, what does that actually look like?
Well, I mean, again, I can sort of tell you what I think it looks like from our perspective, but I mean, I don't know that it's something, to be honest, we have talked to the European Commission about this, and I don't know that it's something that's defined specifically. I think there are different ways of doing this. Certainly in Canada, at the last Canada EU summit, it was announced, and we've started doing some cooperative seminars with experts in Europe. So this is DG Agri and Agriculture Canada, and what we're doing is bringing together experts from academia, from NGOs, from very broadly NGOs, industry, and bringing them all together in a room on both sides. And for example, the first one we did was on soil health. So in very practical terms, what's the state of the art, if you will, in Europe on this? And what's the state of the art in Canada? And it generated a really interesting discussion and a lot of excitement in these experts on this. I mean, I had no idea what they were talking about most of the time, but they were very excited to be learning from each other. And, you know, like, oh, did you know that this was going on at this? So, you know, that kind of cross-fertilization, I think, is very important in very practical terms. At a higher level, I mean, obviously, we've got our CETA agreement in place already, which sort of is accompanied by something called, oh, it's the SPA, the political. It's more sort of a political, social kind of side of the relationship, if you will. Can't believe I can't remember what it is, but it's SPA. And I think, you know, those are the areas where you can have conversations where you bring out these common objectives that we have. And you know, then you sort of get into the details that I talked about a little bit in my introductory remarks. But I think it's really about being open to have some sort of conversation and recognizing that we have similar objectives and how we want to get there. So that can be done through, like I said, through our formal CETA committees, but you don't necessarily need to have that in place. I mean, you can create it. And I think that's it, really. And I mean, I think, of course, there's always, you know, private sector. It doesn't have to be government to government. There can be, you can bring private sector actors together and all sorts of different configurations.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much to the 3 panelists and to all 6 of the panelists that we've had, as well as the speakers in the beginning. I think we've learned a lot today, and also we know that there are some key things coming that I think everybody watching here will be looking out for immediately in the coming days, but also in the coming months. This is, as I mentioned at the outset, a very live issue here in Brussels. And I think that, I mean, I think what we've heard today is some of the concerns about how these EU policies will be affecting the entire value chain and the world more globally, but also that the EU is paying attention to this, that EU policymakers, legislators, people in the Commission, we heard from them ourselves, they're alive to these concerns. They know that there can be ripple effects from EU policy. It happens often in all types of policies, and certainly will happen here in sustainable agriculture policies. So they're alive to it, they're listening to you all, and I think this was a really good way for people to share their concerns and to also make sure that those concerns are being heard by legislators. So lots of stuff to chew over and lots of reports. I see there's been lots of links flying around in the chat of some of the reports that people mentioned, so you can look in there if there's any of the reports that you heard about that you're curious to learn more about. So thank you everybody for spending your afternoon with us, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening.